Australia's military history told through the stories of those who served. This is I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, and this is episode 72, recorded on the 23rd of October, 2024. Sister Ellen Savage and the sinking of the Australian Hospital Ship Centaur. Let's get started. Ellen Savage was born on the 17th of October 1912 in Quirindi in northwestern New South Wales. She was the youngest of three daughters to Russian-born Taylor Henry Savage and Sarah Ann Nee Mulheron, who was a nurse. While all official records list her name as Ellen, there is a considerable number of records that refer to her as Eleanor, though to her family she was known as Nell or Nellie. Brought up in a strong Catholic family, the three Savage daughters were educated at St. Joseph's Convent School in Quirindi. While there, they were very civically minded, regularly participating in charity concerts and fundraising activities, and welcoming any local and departing clergy. Nell was academically gifted and in 1924 received the title of being the convent's top girl following examinations conducted that year. On receiving her intermediate pass in 1928, Nell followed in her mother's footsteps by becoming a nurse, and started her studies at the Royal Newcastle Hospital the following year. When she wasn't studying, Nell enjoyed body surfing at Newcastle's many beaches and is reported to have been an excellent swimmer, though interestingly, she did suffer from seasickness, which is interesting considering that Quirindi is landlocked. She would graduate in 1934 and go on to study obstetrics at the Women's Hospital in Crown Street in Sydney, completing her studies in 1937. She would then go on to study for an additional 12 months, studying mothercraft at the Tresillian Mothercraft Training School in Petersham and what was called a quote-unquote triple certificate nurse. Now, for those wondering, and I have asked several nurses, both university and hospital trained, on what the modern equivalent for this is, and from what they've been able to tell me, there actually isn't a direct modern equivalent. Also, for those wondering, mothercraft is the archaic term for skills and knowledge in looking after children. These days, it's early childhood. At the end of her training, her first professional posting would be at the Baby Health Centre at the regional Australian city of Tamworth in northeastern New South Wales, as part of the New South Wales Public Health Department, where her dimpled smile and good sense of humour would have been greatly appreciated, and this would be the role that she would hold at the outbreak of the Second World War. Nell would enlist on the 24th of May 1941 into the Australian Army Nursing Service and was attached to the newly raised 113th Australian General Hospital at Concord, a hospital that would become known as the Concord Repatriation Hospital, and final mark in so many stories I've already covered. Even as she joined, the wards were already being filled by those wounded soldiers from the North African campaign being returned home for treatment. She would be called up for the second raising of the Australian Imperial Force on the 18th of November and assigned to the reflagged Dutch liner now hospital ship MS Oranje as a sister at the rank of lieutenant. The role of the Oranje was to act as a floating ambulance of sorts, with papers referring to her as the fastest motor ship in the world, able to make the journey from Egypt to Australia in just 11 days. Her role would be take the wounded from the Middle East and India back to Australian military hospitals for treatment, and would routinely carry British, New Zealand, or Australian wounded. Despite Japan's entry into the war on the 7th of December 1941, the chief concern was still the Australian forces currently in North Africa, and as a result, Nell's first trip aboard the Oranje was on the 10th of March 1942 to Egypt to return injured Australian and New Zealand troops back to Australia. During this time, Nell found the conditions of working on the hospital ship stressful and unpleasant. Stressful because she had to contend with treating with seriously injured men, and unpleasant, as I mentioned earlier, Sister Savage got horribly seasick, and this trip was no different. All the while, Nell operated under the fear that while protected by the Geneva Convention, there was still the very real possibility that the Oranje would be attacked and sunk either by mine or enemy submarine. After her first voyage, Nell's only real concern was the severe seasickness that she suffered, which was so bad that she requested matron Sarah Jewell, in charge of the nurses of the Oranje, for a short posting on arrival. Unfortunately for Nell, she was doing her job so efficiently that matron Jewell told her to tough it out and stay aboard, which resulted in her spending 12 months aboard the hospital ship before, on the 12th of May 1943, she was assigned to the newly constructed hospital ship, the AHS Centaur. Originally built in 1924 by the Scots Shipbuilding and Engineering Company in Greenock as a accommodation passenger liner refrigerated cargo ship, like all other British merchant vessels at the start of the war, was pressed into service at the outbreak of the conflict and initially served as a troop ship, her first mission being to recover the survivors of the HSK Cormoran after she'd been sunk and sank HMAS Sydney II. Following this mission, Centaur ran supplies to New Guinea before being handed over to the Australian military for conversion as a hospital ship in January 1943. Following Japan's entry into the war, it was determined rather rapidly that the three existing Australian hospital ships currently in service, the Menunda, the Wanganella, and the Oranje, were unsuitable to operate within the relatively shallow waters of Southeast Asia, which required a new hospital ship with a shallow draft. Sadly, the vessels of the Australian Merchant Navy weren't suitable for this task, so the Australian government requested the British Ministry for Shipping to place Centaur at the disposal of the military on the 4th of January 1943. 5 days later, Centaur was in dry dock undergoing refitting as a hospital ship. Her defensive armaments, a necessity for a merchant vessel but in violation of the 1907 Hague Convention, quote, adaptation to maritime war of the principles of the Geneva Convention, unquote, had to be removed, and her hull was painted white with a thick green band circumnavigating the hull, signifying it as a military hospital ship. This band was broken by large red crosses evenly spaced along the hull, which were all illuminated by large flood lamps. The vessel had a fully equipped operating theatre and dental surgery and could carry 252 patients. The vessel was then registered to the International Committee of the Red Cross within the first week of February, which then informed the Japanese government of this registry. Her overhaul complete, she was re-entered into service as the 2nd 3rd AHS Centaur on the 12th of March 1943, where she conducted test and transport runs, mainly from Sydney to Melbourne, where kinks were worked out and defects remedied. Next, she transported wounded men from Townsville to Brisbane, followed by another trip from Port Moresby to Brisbane. During the course of researching this episode, I frequently encountered references to Centaur being referred to as HMAS or HMAHS, suggesting that the ship had been commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy or registered as His Majesty's Australian Hospital Ship. However, both of these are incorrect. Aside from the fact that the ship's medical staff belonged to the Australian Army Medical Corps, Centaur was still a repurposed British merchant vessel and had a British merchant crew. In fact, of the 6 Australian-operated hospital ships used during the Second World War, only those under the Australian Shipping Control Board were officially designated as HMAHS, namely the Wanganella and the Menunda. Other hospital ships, such as the Dutch-flagged Oranje, retained their original national registrations and crews under the Hague Conventions. All Australian-operated hospital ships, including Centaur, however, were all officially registered with the International Red Cross as Australian hospital ships. Nell and 12 other nursing sisters, mostly from the Oranje, joined Centaur when she put into Sydney on the 8th of May, where the ship took on men and equipment of the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance, destined for New Guinea, and once replenished, her civilian crew sailed on the 12th of May. Now, I've done several videos on social media on Centaur and her fate, and one question that keeps popping up was, why was the crew of the Centaur civilian when it was in a sense a military vessel? Now, I've already kind of touched on this, as the main reason was surprisingly difficult to actually narrow down. But it stems from the fact that as hospital ships, they are, as provisioned by the Hague and Geneva Conventions, exempt from hostile action, and almost exclusively repurposed merchant liners. This doesn't actually answer the question, but that's the closest I can get to an answer. For the Centaur, that extended to a tense exchange where the crew of Centaur initially refused to allow the personal arms of the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance, weapons as outlined by the 10th Hague Convention they were allowed to have for the quote-unquote maintenance of order and good discipline and the defense of the wounded. The crew begrudgingly allowed this, but searched the rest of the cargo being brought aboard for any further weapons. Despite a waterside Union stop work, Centaur departed Sydney at 10:44 on the 12th of May. Aboard her was 192 men of the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance, 53 additional medical personnel attached to the Centaur, her 75-man merchant mariner crew, along with Sister Savage and her fellow nurses. As Centaur steamed north, heading for Cairns and then on to New Guinea to deliver the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance, her civilian master, Captain George Murray, was well aware that the sea around Australia was a battle zone, with 27 Japanese submarines prowling the sea lanes between June 1942 and December 1944, which resulted in 50 merchant vessels being attacked, with 20 being sunk, and Centaur would actually pass the wreck sites of the Kalingo, the Lydia M. Childs, the Wollongbar, and the Fingal, and the Limerick as she made her way north. After 2 days of uneventful sailing, where the nurses participated in lifeboat drills and tended to the minor injuries and maladies that afflicted the ship's complement, on the night of the 13th of May, the complement came together to celebrate the birthday of Matron Jewel, who had joined Nell from the Oranje. In addition to the Oranje, most of the nurses on Centaur had actually served together since their time with 113th AGH in Concord Hospital. Prior to departing Sydney, the nurses took a collection and purchased a cake for their matron, which the ship's cooking staff decorated with white frosting, and wrote in pink icing, "Happy Birthday from the Centaur." The male passengers partook of the captain's hospitality, who granted the ship's complement 2 bottles of beer, while the nurses retired to the ship's main saloon to continue their own celebrations, and by 10 p.m. they all said their goodnights and retired to their cabins to sleep. For most of the passengers and crew, they would not wake up. At 04:10 on the 14th of May 1943, as Centaur passed close to Moreton Island off the coast of Queensland, a Japanese submarine, I-177, under the command of Commander Hajime Nakajawa, stalked the vessel. The ship was fully illuminated by large floodlights, its white hull clearly visible with a thick green band circling it, as per the conditions of the Geneva and Hague Conventions. A lookout spotted what initially appeared to be a porpoise streaking towards the ship, only to realise too late that it was a torpedo, speeding towards the vessel. The torpedo struck the portside number 3 oil tank approximately 2 metres below the waterline, creating a hole between 8 to 10 metres across. The explosion ignited the ship's highly flammable fuel reserves, quickly engulfing the vessel. Apparently, the explosion was so large that it had been seen by the Nudgee Beach searchlight battery operated by 56 Battery Royal Australian engineers, though they had no idea what had transpired, and in the morning they'd been told by security to not report what they had seen. In a sad irony, prior to her conversion as a hospital ship in 1938, Centaur, then a cargo steamer, came to the rescue of the Kiyomaru 2, a Japanese whaler that had developed boiler problems while steaming back from Antarctica. Centaur responded to their distress call and towed the Kiyomaru to Geraldton on the West Australian coast. Now, unlike the Titanic that friend of the podcast, Melissa Ratliff, can attest to, which was a gradual sinking that allowed the significant portion of the passengers and crew to escape, Centaur was a ball of flame from the bridge aft and immediately started taking on water from the impact site. She rolled to port and then sank bow first as unsecured ballast rushed forward, slipping beneath the waves in just 3 minutes. The rapidity of the sinking meant that there was no time to deploy lifeboats of those that weren't already damaged, though 2 broke free during the sinking, though there was very few survivors who could make use of them. Sister Ellen Savage was jolted awake by the concussive blast and thrown violently from her bunk. Disorientated but instinctively concerned, she immediately checked on her bunkmate, Sister Mel Mostyn, who had been thrown out by the explosion. Together, they managed to get to their feet and looked out the cabin's porthole window, only to see the ship engulfed in flames. Initially paralysed by shock, Nell struggled to act until her friend, Sister Evelyn King, burst in from an adjoining cabin and commanded, "Quick, Savage, out on the deck, now!" Reacting to the urgency, they grabbed their life jackets. Thankfully, Nell had not stowed hers from that day's lifeboat drill, which saved them precious seconds in the chaos. Now, according to the evacuation drills they'd undertaken that morning, they were instructed to make their way through the companionway to the deck and then onto the lifeboats. But as they approached it, they realised that it was ablaze. Forced to find another route, they eventually found their way back to the deck, only to find it strewn with wreckage. The bridge was ablaze and waves engulfed the ship from the bow. While there, they were greeted by the military commanding officer of Centaur, Lieutenant Colonel Clement Paulson Manson, who despite the hour was fully dressed, including his cap and Mae West life jacket. He turned to the nurses, who calmly told them, quote-unquote, "That's right, girlies, jump for it now." Now, the 3 women were dressed in their silk pajamas, appropriate attire for the warm subtropical weather of the coast of Queensland, but would mean certain death in the frigid water below. Nell asked Colonel Manson if she had enough time to return to her cabin to collect her greatcoat, to which Manson told her no and to jump, which she did. Now, much like Melissa's beau, Charles Lightoller, the second officer of the Titanic, Nell was pulled under by the suction caused by Centaur's rapid sinking. Being struck in the head by debris and suffering several injuries, she became tangled in the ship's ropes that threatened to send her down with the ship. Miraculously, she became free of the ropes and the suction and shot to the surface. As she broke the surface and looked around, to her horror, Centaur was gone, and neither of the nurses that had been with her could be found. She had lost sight of Sister King. She didn't know if she made it off the ship or was killed in the water. And Sister Mostyn sadly made it off the ship, but was killed by debris in the water as thick, boiling oil leaked around the wreck site, coating oil who bobbed in the water or clung to wreckage. Of the nurses, women she had served with since the outbreak of the war, she would be the sole survivor. The others were already dead, or soon would be. Most of them would have been killed in their sleep. As Nell looked around, she found herself near Corporal Thompson Malcolm, one of the ship's medical staff, and the 2 swam towards a piece of flotsam, what remained of one of the deckhouses, and both clambered aboard. Unlike hospital ships operated by British or German forces at this time in the war in the Northern Hemisphere, which added an extra layer of protection by broadcasting their locations through scheduled radio traffic, this was not the practice of the Australian Army, and as a result, although Centaur was fully illuminated, she was not transmitting her location. This meant that the only indication of something having gone wrong, which would have been when she failed to arrive at her next port of call in Cairns by her scheduled arrival time. Consequently, it could take at least 4 days before her absence was noticed and search efforts were initiated. Until help arrived, the survivors were on their own, suffering wounds and burns exacerbated by sunburn, blisters, and exposure. As dawn broke, Nell and Corporal Malcolm looked out at the devastation and found some 50 yards away a large raft crowded with bloodied, oil-covered and half-naked men. There were other makeshift rafts scattered amongst the wreckage, and in a cruel twist of fate, a lot of these rafts were made of red wood, the remains of the red crosses that were supposed to protect Centaur. The men on the larger raft tied a rope around one of the survivors who swam out to Nell and Malcolm to bring them aboard, and once Nell stepped onto the larger raft, she saw another threat that was lurking amongst the wreckage: sharks. The tiger and grey nurse sharks first arrived in ones and twos, and then in their dozens as they swam in layered circles around them, hoping to pick off any sailor unfortunate enough to fall in the water. And it was at this moment that Nell also realised she was dressed only in her torn pyjamas, and around her, many of the men were similarly damaged clothing or completely naked, their clothes having been torn away by the suction of Centaur's sinking or shredded by debris. Compassionately, one soldier offered her a pair of khaki trousers, while another gave her his greatcoat. The other realization Nell had was that she was the only surviving nurse amongst the survivors, and nearly every man around her was injured in some way or another. Despite her own injuries, including broken ribs, a broken nose, perforated eardrums, ruptured palate, and numerous lacerations and bruises, including a black eye, Nell immediately set to work tending to their wounds, bathing wounds with salt water and wrapping them in bandages salvaged from recovered medical kits. She even massaged the feet of one survivor to maintain circulation. By midday, the survivors spotted a plane and launched flares, but they weren't spotted. Then they saw ships on the horizon, but again, they were just dots amongst the vast ocean. Eventually, the grueling ordeal of surviving the Centaur's sinking and enduring hours adrift in the open ocean, exposed to the relentless elements, began to take its toll. Exhausted and weakened, some survivors slipped from the wreckage into the sea. Yet, in extraordinary displays of camaraderie and determination, their brother soldiers fought against their own fatigue to pull them back to safety, rescuing them from the ever-present threat of the waiting sharks. The survivors were led by Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Malcolm Outridge, the only surviving doctor and only surviving officer, who quickly assumed command amidst the chaos. Recognizing the dire circumstances, he instructed Nell to oversee the distribution of their meager supplies. 2,000 milk tablets, a tin of prunes, a tin of raisins, some meat extract, 2 pounds of chocolate, and 2 gallons of water. Facing the grim prospect of up to 4 days at sea, Nell implemented strict rationing. Each survivor received a lick of meat extract, a single milk tablet, 2 prunes, and a mouthful of water to sustain them through the ordeal. Soon enough, as recounted by survivor Ronald Mott, eventually the survivors felt they could have drunk the entire ocean dry. In between tending to their wounds and providing them with rations, Nell also kept the men's spirits by reciting the rosary, with even non-Catholics joining in. She also had led the survivors in songs, with Waltzing Matilda and Roll Out the Battle being regularly sung. As night fell on the survivors on the first day at sea, a new terror emerged. At around 03:30, a silhouette emerged from the depths about half a mile away. Despite some survivors launching flares, it was quickly realized that this ship was not a savior. It was in fact a Japanese submarine, with most accounts speculating that it was I-177, the same submarine that sank Centaur. Immediately, Colonel Outridge ordered all lights extinguished and for the survivors to remain silent. On top of the noise of the ocean, the survivors heard the drone of an engine and the unmistakable sound of a voice calling out, "Cooey!" A survivor located next to Nell leant over and warned the others, quote, "Don't answer, they're Japs. Remember, sailors never say cooey, they say ahoy," unquote. He had been at Rabaul, where a similar event occurred which resulted in the submarine opening fire on the survivors. This warning kept everyone quiet. All Nell could see was a flashing green light, a light that filled her with dread as she wondered if this was where her story ended or if she was going to spend the rest of the war in Tokyo. After half an hour, the submarine lost interest in the survivors and submerged once more, leaving them once again in silence, though now they wondered if the sub was simply waiting for rescue ships to spring another sneak attack. The following morning, the survivors were greeted by the sound of an approaching plane, which caused excitement amongst them until the dreaded realization was that the plane hadn't seen them. However, rescue was not that far away, as at 1340 on the 15th of May 1943, a Navro Anson multi-role trainer attached to No. 71 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force was conducting anti-submarine sweeps in support of Convoy X that departed Brisbane that morning when it discovered an object in the water, and when it dived to identify it, reported seeing a lifeboat containing 30 live persons. After signalling to the survivors that they had been seen and help was on its way, the Anson returned to the convoy and signaled the Bagley-class destroyer USS Mugford, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Savo Island, tasked with escorting the New Zealand-flagged freighter Sussex from Brisbane on a Trans-Tasman transit. Simultaneously, lookouts at Mugford also reported seeing objects in the water, and the commanding officer of Mugford, Lieutenant Commander Howard George Corrie, ordered the Anson to stay with the Sussex and ordered his ship to prepare to conduct rescue operations, which came to a surprise as there had been no word of any ships sunk in that region that night or in the previous nights, as Centaur had not yet been reported lost. Upon seeing the grey hull of Mugford approaching, Nell finally allowed herself to let her guard down, and she burst into tears of relief. Mugford would reach the survivors at 14:15 that afternoon, 34 hours after Centaur had sunk. At the same time, Mugford made contact with the naval officer in charge in Brisbane, Captain Edward Penry Thomas, reporting that they were picking up survivors from the hospital ship Centaur, marking the first official indication on the mainland that the ship had been sunk. For the sailors of Mugford, they were shocked to see dozens of oil-slicked, sunburned, blistered figures huddled to rafts and debris. But it was the sound of a woman's voice calling out to them, warning them about sharks, that surprised them most. As soon as Mugford was as close as it safely could be, American sailors dove into the water as their brother sailors fired revolvers, rifles, and machine guns into the water to keep the sharks at bay. One by one, the rafts were hauled alongside Mugford, and Jacob's ladders were deployed to bring the survivors onto the deck. When Nell was brought aboard, it was reported that the men cheered for her, and it was at that point where they discovered the severity of her injuries. She had endured agony for 34 hours to ensure the safety of the men under her charge. In total, of the 332 souls embarked aboard Centaur, reports estimated that roughly 200 made it off the ship during the sinking. Mugford would sadly only pluck 64 from the water. The others either succumbed to their wounds or were unable to get onto one of the rafts and drowned. It would take roughly an hour and 20 minutes to recover the survivors, though the process would be routinely interrupted by false reports of enemy submarines and torpedoes being spotted, slowing efforts. Mugford remained on station until dark to continue the search, and after nightfall, Mugford put into Port Brisbane and offloaded the survivors to a military hospital to be interviewed by military authorities. Mugford handed over the search to the naval officer in charge as Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Commander McManus, who ordered the USS Helm to the area to continue the search during the night, and the search would be picked up by HMAS Yarra and 4 motor torpedo boats over the next 4 days. Sadly, there would be no further survivors. Almost immediately, the publicity censor put a hold on any media reporting in regards to Centaur and denied any journalist any request to gain access to any of the survivors or for more information. The day after the recovery, Commander-in-Chief Southwest Pacific General Douglas MacArthur was sent a memo to the Australian Prime Minister John Curtin outlining the basic details of the attack and the survivors' experience, including 3 eyewitness accounts of seeing the Japanese submarine near the side of the wreck, and with his decision to withhold the information until the next of kin were notified. For Nell's family, they initially had only been informed that she was in hospital and assumed that she was simply suffering from seasickness. However, that telegram would be quickly followed by an explanation that she'd been injured as a result of enemy action and quickly boarded the train for Brisbane. Though by the time they arrived, the news could no longer be kept a secret, and it was now front-page news, not only in Australia, but in all allied nations, even overshadowing the achievement of the Dambuster raid that occurred on the same day. The Allied powers' reaction was unanimous in this condemnation of the sinking. For the Australian public, the loss of the Centaur was met with outrage, a noted difference amongst the reporting of Australian warships and merchant vessels that had been sunk up to that point. The intentional attacking of a hospital ship was a violation of the 10th Hague Convention of 1907, and thus a war crime. Propaganda started being released depicting the final moments of Centaur with the words, "Avenge the nurses," proudly placed upon it. Immediately following the announcement to the public, Prime Minister Curtin, through Swiss officials, issued an immediate protest to the Japanese government, condemning the attack and demanding assurances that this was a one-off incident and all further engagements would be done in accordance with international law. For the public, there was a mix of grief and rage as that a hospital ship had been sunk, but funds were quickly raised not only to help the wounded and the families of those killed, but also to equip and outfit a whole new hospital ship to replace her. For the military, their response was not as measured, but they universally condemned the attack, declaring that Centaur had been deliberately attacked in full knowledge of her status. And that response was not isolated to Australian forces. It was also reported that United States Army Air Force General George Kenney had to talk down a sergeant bombardier from organizing a retaliatory bombing run on a Japanese hospital ship known to be operating in their area of responsibility. 6 days after the news broke, the Department of the Army requested that identification markings and lights of the hospital ship Menunda be removed, defensive weapons be installed, and that she was to travel under escort blacked out. Even though the conversion had been carried out, it took the intervention of the United States and New Zealand governments for the conversion to be reversed, stating that it would have been better to wait until further attacks to see if it was not a one-off by a crazed Japanese commander. After the announcement of the sinking of the Centaur was made public, the reporters were given access to the survivors. Lieutenant Colonel Outridge was then interviewed, stating that, quote, "Their devotion will not be forgotten, but their murder will not be left unavenged," unquote. For all the death associated with the sinking of the Centaur, the ones that courted the greatest reaction was the death of the 11 nurses, and once it was reported that one had survived, Nell had become the focus of a lot of the reporting, even if most of it initially misnamed her as Eleanor. They would report that her caring for the wounded despite being injured herself, that she rationed their bigger supplies, led prayers, and sing-alongs to keep morale up. Nell would be interviewed by Movietone News, still in her hospital bed. While there, she told her story of how she escaped the ship, and when the interviewer commented about her actions on the raft, Nell was quick to point out that her actions would have been no different than any other nurse had they been in her place. On the 11th of June, Nell was discharged from hospital and was at her family's Gordon home recuperating, and it would be another 2 months on the 14th of August when she'd be fit to return to duty. Though when she did, it would not be to another hospital ship, but her old posting at the 113 Australian General Hospital. While working at the 113 AGH, she would actually meet a more famous Eleanor, that being the wife of President of the United States Eleanor Roosevelt, when she visited Australia on the 9th of September and met Nell and fellow famous Australian nurse Sister Margaret Anderson, who had received the George Medal for actions in Malaya. While in Sydney, Mrs. Roosevelt also spoke to the wounded soldiers from New Guinea who were also being treated at the hospital. In December 1943, the Japanese government responded to the accusations in regards to the sinking, stating that they had no information to justify the allegations, refusing to accept responsibility for the sinking, even going so far to accuse Australian authorities of orchestrating the attack themselves. They also counter-protested that 9 hospital ships had been attacked by the Allies, but these accusations were targeted more at the Americans than the Australians, and while sporadic communication would continue between Britain and Japan, there wouldn't be any progress, and by the 14th of November 1944, the British government informed the Australian counterparts that no further communication would be attempted with the Japanese in regard to Centaur. In 1944, the 113th was redesignated the 113 Concord Military Hospital, and on the first anniversary of the sinking, Nell placed a memorial notice in the Sydney Morning Herald honouring her fallen friends. And in August, Nell would find herself a patient of her own hospital as she recovered from an unspecified illness. It was here that she would find out that she was also going to be awarded the George Medal, and in doing so would become the second Australian woman to receive the award. The citation read, quote, "Although suffering from severe injuries received as a result of the explosion and immersion in the sea, she displayed great heroism during the period while she and some male members of the ship's staff were floating on a raft, to which they clung for about 34 hours before being rescued by a US destroyer. She gave conspicuous service while on the raft and attending to the wounds and burns suffered by other survivors. Her courage and fortitude did much to maintain the morale of her companions," unquote. This would be followed by Nell and other survivors of Centaur testifying on the 29th of August 1944 in the Australian War Crimes Commission, which was an inquiry to determine if a war crime had taken place. Nell's newfound fame as the most recognisable survivor from Centaur meant that she was in high demand. When in May 1945, when she was invited to Quirindi to open the Red Cross Ball and be the guest of honour for the 500 attendees, where she also would receive the debutantes who debuted at the ceremony. The following month, at the request of the men and managers of the government shipbuilding yards in Sydney, she also was present for the launch of the Army's newest supply vessel. She would continue to work at the Concord Repatriation Hospital until the end of the war, and when she was demobilised on the 8th of March 1946, she was appointed to the post of senior sister at the Royal Newcastle Hospital, where she developed a fearful reputation for insisting on a high standard of discipline and knowledge, and while there she also resumed her work with the New South Wales Public Health Department. In April of 1947, Nell was surprised to learn that she had been selected as the recipient of a postgraduate scholarship for a diploma in hospital administration from the New South Wales branch of the Florence Nightingale Memorial Committee, to be completed at the prestigious Royal College of Nursing in London that October. Though frustratingly, while she was the recipient, the committee had not been able to raise the funds required to actually send Nell to London, and a public appeal was made to raise the £700. Unfortunately, the public interest was low and less than £100 were raised in the 2 weeks after the announcement was made. Fortunately, the Australian Red Cross stepped in and paid the rest of her scholarship, paying for the course, travel and accommodation, and by the end of June, she was on her way for 18 months. On her departure, her friends gifted her a unique present, £5 of butter for the journey. While she was in London, funds were starting to be raised for the establishment of Centaur House in Brisbane through the Centaur Memorial Fund for Nurses, which provided educational, recreational and accommodation facilities for nurses in Queensland, an initiative that Nell threw her complete support behind and one that survives to this day. While her journey gained her another qualification, bringing a total of 4 and an opportunity to visit numerous British hospitals to see how they operated, Nell was also presented to the royal family in May 1948, along with a number of other Australians, and on her way home, she had an audience with the Pope before returning to Sydney in December 1948. And the Royal Newcastle Hospital, where in February 1949, she was appointed as supervising sister and would have the distinction of being the most qualified nurse in New South Wales. Unfortunately, her rigid adherence to military discipline and deportment seemed to be her undoing, as while she was expected to be made Director of Nursing, according to her Australian Dictionary of Biography entry, she was passed over by the medical superintendent, Dr. Christian McCaffrey, because, quote, he believed that she was entrenched in the old school mode, wanting to maintain a subservience to military discipline, unquote. Though that would not stop her from being the matron of the hospital's chest clinic at Rankin Park from 1950 until ill health forced her resignation in 1967. Before her appointment as matron at the Rankin Park Chest Unit, Nell was also a founding member of the Australian College of Nursing, and she represented the college on a 4-day Queensland tour. During this visit, she also received numerous cheques for the Centaur House that was now open. Returning to Sydney at the end of August, she finally met up with another famous survivor, that being matron Vivian Bullwinkle, survivor of the Banker Island Massacre and the topic of episode 3. The two women have been pen pals since their ordeals had become public knowledge, and the two women were to lead the Legacy Week commemorations, including a march of war orphans to the Cenotaph in Martin Place in Sydney, and this was the first time they would be meeting. Legacy Week is usually run during the first week of September and is a national appeal established in the 1940s to support the families of military personnel who had lost their lives or health as a result of their service. It was formed by Legacy, founded by Captain Stanley Savage, no relation, back in 1923, as a need to assist the families of fallen soldiers during the First World War. News reports of the march state there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as both women led two fatherless children between the Guard of Honour to lay wreaths at the monument built to honour the service and sacrifice of the Australians killed during the First World War. Every year, Nell also attended Anzac Day marches and nurses' reunions in Sydney. In 1953, Nell and Ronald Spuds Jones represented the Centaur survivors at the 10th anniversary ceremony, where they laid wreaths at the cenotaph. While still serving as a member of the Australian College of Nursing Council, even serving as the council's president from 1957 to 1958. In 1955, the story of the sinking of the Centaur reached a new generation due to a radio broadcast by the Australian Broadcast Corporation, the ABC, as part of their Anzac Day Eve ceremonies broadcast into Australian schools. By 1963, Nell was one of 6 central survivors to lay a wreath at the cenotaph for the 20th anniversary of the sinking, and 4 years later, after 38 years in the nursing profession, matron Ellen Savage retired and moved back to the family home in Gordon to live with her sister Winifred, though she would remain active in charity work, in particular with Centaur House and Legacy, and in 1977 she agreed to be interviewed by the Australian War Memorial to record that night in May 1943 for posterity and to quote, "for the sake of the girls and Centaur who made the supreme sacrifice," unquote. This video was premiered on the ABC in Anzac Day 1978. 2 years later, she'd be interviewed by the ABC Radio's Scarlet and Grey program, which told of stories of Australian Army nurses. In 1985, at 72 years old, matron Ellen Savage, after her usual observance of Anzac Day, followed by attending the nurses' lunch and reunion at Sydney Hospital, stepped outside to get a taxi home when she collapsed. She would pass away later that day. As she never married, she is survived by her surviving sisters. She was buried at the Macquarie Park Cemetery and Crematorium under Catholic rites, interred at her mother's grave under the inscription chosen by her family, loved daughter of the late Henry and Sarah Savage of Quirindi, New South Wales. She's also commemorated on the Gold Coast AHS Centaur Memorial, the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital Memorial Rose Garden, and has her portrait prominently displayed above the model of the Centaur in the Second World War Gallery of the Australian War Memorial. Now, the reason on why Centaur was attacked by I-177 has been the topic of wonder since the first reports of her sinking, with speculation and conspiracy theory plaguing the survivors every time the anniversary of the sinking returned to the public consciousness, and all of these theories are generally broken down into 3 distinct categories. The first was that Centaur was a legitimate target. Now, the only way for Centaur to have been declared a legitimate target is if she violated the terms of the Hague Convention, namely if I-177 was able to determine that she was being used to carry troops or war material. When departing Sydney, her decks would have been crowded by green uniformed men of the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance, who at a distance would have been unmistakable for regular AIF forces, who had also been witnessed boarding with their own weapons, as allowed to by the Article 10 of the Convention. Now, had a spy witnessed this and managed to get word to I-177, it would then be in wait for a legitimate target. The issue with that theory is that Centaur didn't take the normal route to Brisbane, but an alternate one, which would have required I-177 to be able to predict this. In addition to this theory, there was the notion that because Centaur was a troop ship prior to her conversion to hospital ship, that I-177 was operating under old data. However, given that this might have been a possibility, the decision was made that any quasi-medical staff like reparation teams were no longer allowed on hospital ships, and ambulance drivers had to transfer from the regular army to the Australian Army Medical Corps before they were allowed aboard, though they were still technically permitted to carry their unloaded weapons and ammunition. The second theory was that it was an unfortunate accident that Commander Nakajawa was completely unaware that he was attacking a hospital ship, which is only supported by evidence given by the officers that replaced him in command of I-177, in that there was no boatside gossip of them discussing sinking hospital ship. And generally, this theory falls apart considering how illuminated Centaur was, save for 2 bow floodlights, which were extinguished as they actually impeded navigation. The argument given that if I-177 was in the wrong position, they couldn't have been able to positively identify the ship as a protected non-combatant. The third theory revolves around the notion that Nakagawa was fully aware that Centaur was a hospital ship and decided to attack it regardless. This theory stems from the fact that not long after Centaur's sinking, Nakagawa was reaching the end of his tour aboard I-177 and had only sunk one Allied vessel, the Limerick, prior to that point, and didn't want to return with the disgrace of only one kill. Other claims infer that he was acting on vengeance on the Japanese casualties during the Battle of Bismarck Sea, though the most damning evidence was that following the sinking of the Centaur, when in command of I-37, Nakagawa ordered the machine gunning of survivors of 3 British merchant vessels that he had torpedoed in 1944. Unfortunately, no evidence was able to be recovered to the standard of beyond reasonable doubt that could be found relating to the sinking of the Centaur that could be found relating to Nakagawa or anyone else. Nakagawa was only found guilty for the killing of the British merchant mariners and sentenced to only 4 years imprisonment in the post-war war crimes tribunals. And it wasn't actually until the 1970s that historians released that the most probable perpetrator for Centaur's sinking was I-177. If I-177 was directly responsible for the sinking of Centaur, on the 3rd of October 1944, Centaur would be avenged as I-177 near the Palau Islands would be spotted by radar aboard the escort carrier USS Hoggett Bay. The US destroyer USS Samuel S. Miles was sent to investigate, and in 0440, the Miles sighted the submarine on the surface and raced towards it. Seeing her attacker, I-177 attempted to crash dive, but the Miles located her once again on sonar. They fired 24 Mark 10 Hedgehog projector charges and followed with a second salvo. That was enough to sink the submarine and her entire crew of 101 aboard. In 2008, following the successful discovery of the wreck of the HMAS Sydney 2, increased public interest called for Centaur's wreck to be rediscovered, and investigating various claims and recollections, finally was discovered the wreck of Centaur on the 12th of January 2010, resting at a depth of 2,059 meters below sea level. The site has now been classified as a war grave, and a plaque has been affixed to the wreck. And there you have it, folks. That is the life, service, and legacy of Sister Ellen Savage, GM, a woman of extraordinary courage who exemplified selflessness and duty in the face of unimaginable adversity. Her actions during and after the sinking of Centaur not only saved lives, but also inspired countless Australians. Whether tending to the wounded at sea, advocating for the nursing profession, or preserving the memory of those lost, Ellen Savage demonstrated a profound strength of character that continues to resonate today. Her story reminds us of the sacrifices made by so many, and for that, we are eternally grateful. References in this episode are the heroism of Nurse Ellen Savage during the sinking of the Centaur in Moreton Bay by Redcliffe Today, Naval Association to hold ceremony for AHS Centaur by the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Ellen Savage Stories of Service and the Sinking of the Centaur by the DVA's Anzac Portal, Australian Hospital Ships by the Naval Historical Society of Australia, Trove, the online newspaper archive of the National Library of Australia, Australian War Memorial's Australia Under Attack exhibit, Australian War Memorial marks 80 years since the loss of AHS Centaur, last post ceremony commemorating the service of NX 70578 Major Lander Holland, a second and third Australian Hospital Ship Centaur, Second World War at the Australian War Memorial, recorded on the 14th of May 2015, Sinking of the Centaur by Dr. Carl James, Talmadge Johnson and the USS Mugford and Hospital Ship Centaur by Diane Rutherford, I Knew in My Heart What Had Happened by Claire Hunter, Laws of War, Adaptation to Maritime War, The Principles of Geneva Convention, Hague 10, October 18, 1907, from the Yale Law School Lillian Goldman Law Library, Hospital Ships of World War II by the Torpedo Bay Navy Museum, The Service Record of Sister Ellen Savage by the National Archives of Australia, World War II Australian Hospital Ships by Company of Master Mariners of Australia, the Australian Dictionary Biography entry on Sister Ellen Savage, Sister Ellen Savage 1912-1985, Australian nurse who rallied a nation at war by Working Nurse, Avenge the Nurses, 80 years on from the sinking of the AHS Centaur by the Australian College of Nursing, the Virtual War Memorial Australian entry on Ellen Savage, the Australian Women's Register entry on Ellen Savage, World War II Hospital Ship MS Orania by Port Melbourne Historical and Preservation Society, Australian Hospital Ship Centaur by the Moreton Bay Regional Libraries, The Law of Belligerency at Sea by the International Law of the Sea, Volume 2, Merchant Navy in World War II by the State Library of Queensland, Sister Ellen Savage Memorial entry at the New South Wales War Memorials Registry, Navy Hospital Ships in History by the Journal of Marine Medicine Society, from the Archives 1943, Japan Torpedoes Australian Hospital Ship Centaur by the Sydney Morning Herald, the Centaur Memorial Fund for Nurses website, the Oz at War website, the NavSource Naval History entry of USS Mugford, NH 55806 USS Mugford DD 389 by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the AHS Centaur Education Assets for the Australian Red Cross Society, the Find a Grave entry on Ellen Savage, the International Humanitarian Law Databases, and the website of the Australian War Memorial. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History. This podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of each and every one of you, especially our Armed Emu Brigade community. This episode was recorded in the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and we pay our respects to their elders who have passed on knowledge for thousands of years. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License, and all opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not reflect the views or positions of any entity, agency, or organization. If you like what we do here and want to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is share it with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Trust me, I read all the reviews and your feedback truly helps others find the show. You can also support us on Patreon, where your contributions will help keeping the podcast running. Plus, don't forget to check out our merch store for the Armored Emu Brigade unit patches. They're perfect for any fan. To join in on the conversation, come chat with us on Discord. For more content, including photos, show notes, and transcripts, head over to the website at thedocnetwork.net and follow the show at IWODMJ on all social media. I'm at Doc Winters. And once again, friends, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye. Australia's military history told through the stories of those who served. This has been a Doc Network production.